The Jackson family carried a story for generations, a story about an ancestor named July who was part Native American, a medicine man, a scout, a man whose blood explained why some Jacksons had lighter skin, green eyes, and hair that did not match the photographs. The story passed from grandfather to son, the way all important stories do. DNA proved it was never true. Not the Native American ancestor, not the medicine man, not the indigenous heritage that Joe Jackson referenced in his own book and that family members cited for decades whenever someone asked where the Jacksons really came from. What the Y chromosome actually carried was something no one in the family had ever been told, something that pointed not to the American interior and its native peoples, but to a plantation in South Carolina, and before that, to a country in Western Europe that nobody in the Jackson family had any reason to name. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. To understand what the DNA found, you have to understand where it was looking. And to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning of the Jackson family story, not Gary, Indiana, and not the Motown years, but the place the family actually came from, generations before any of them had names anyone would recognize. Joseph Jackson was born in 1929 in Fountain Hill, Arkansas. His father was Samuel Jackson. His grandfather before Samuel was Israel, known in family records as Nero Jackson. Nero Jackson was born into slavery around 1838 in the American South. He emerged from that system after emancipation, carrying almost nothing except a name that had been given to him by other people, and a family story about where he came from that, it would turn out, was not quite right. Before Nero, the paper trail gets thin in the way it always gets thin for enslaved families. The records that exist describe property, not people. They list values, not origins. They give ages and approximations and first names only. And they say nothing about where those people came from before the plantation, what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or what they knew about the generations behind them. This is the genealogical wall that sits inside almost every African American family tree. It is not a mystery someone created by keeping secrets. Those secrets were certainly kept. It is a structural feature of American slavery, built deliberately into the legal and administrative architecture of a system designed to make the people inside it untraceable. Enslaved people were not permitted to record their own histories. Their marriages were not legally recognized. Their children belonged to whoever owned their mother. Their African names, languages, and origins were systematically stripped across generations until what remained was a first name, an estimated age, and a dollar value in someone else's estate inventory. For the Jackson family, as for millions of others, that wall sits somewhere in the years before emancipation. And for generations, the family filled that silence with the story they had, the story about July, the medicine man, the Native American ancestor who explained the family's unusual features in the sense passed down through decades that they were something more complicated than the historical record allowed them to prove. That story was wrong, not maliciously wrong, not invented from nothing, wrong in the way that families construct explanations for what they cannot document, drawing on the available vocabulary of difference, reaching for the narrative that makes sense of the evidence they can see. The DNA would eventually show them what the evidence actually meant. The investigation that cracked the Jackson paternal line open was not a television genealogy project. It was carried out by a man named Thomas Jackson, a descendant of Nero Jackson, who became interested in confirming the family's oral history about Native American ancestry. He approached the project the way serious genealogists do, starting with documents, moving to DNA when the documents ran out, and following the results wherever they led, even when they led somewhere no one expected. Thomas began by searching Native American rolls, the official records that identified individuals as members of recognized tribes. He found nothing. No Jackson ancestor appeared on any tribal roll. The paper trail he could assemble took the family not toward the American interior and its indigenous nations, but in the opposite direction entirely, back to Sumter County, South Carolina, and to a plantation owned by a man named James Joel Richborg. James Joel Richborg was a descendant of Claude Philippe de Richborg, a French Huguenot who had immigrated to the American colonies in the early 18th century. The Huguenots were French Protestants who fled Catholic persecution in France beginning in the late 17th century, resettling in England, the Netherlands, and the American colonies, where they established themselves as landowners, merchants, and slaveholders. Claude Philippe de Richborg arrived in South Carolina around 1700. His descendants, bearing the anglicized surname Richburg or Richborg, became part of the planter class that defined the antebellum South. James Joel Richborg owned enslaved people. Among them was a man named July. July appears in Richborg's records as property. He was enslaved on the Richborg plantation in Sumter County, South Carolina, at a time when the plantation system was at its height and when the legal category of enslaved person meant total ownership of a human being's body, labor, movement, family relationships, and future. What July knew about his own origins, what language his mother spoke, where his family had come from before the plantation, none of that survives in any record. What survives is the ledger entry, the dollar amount, the transfer of ownership that would set everything that followed into motion. When James Joel Richborg died in 1804, he wrote a will. In that will, he bequeathed July to his daughter Mary. Mary Richborg married a man named Josiah Gale III. July went with her to Mississippi, and in the records that appear after that transfer, he is listed as July Gale, having taken the surname of his new enslavers. The way enslaved people throughout the South were made to carry the names of the people who owned them, rather than names of their own choosing. July Gale was known for skills that made him valuable and memorable. Family history, preserved in the oral tradition that Thomas Jackson III spent years trying to document, describes July as a medicine man, a healer who knew plants and treatments, and as a scout who worked with the United States Army. These stories became the foundation of the family belief in Native American ancestry. July's knowledge of medicinal plants, his scouting abilities, his unusual features, all of it got folded into a story about indigenous heritage that passed through generations as family truth. But there was another explanation for July's features, and DNA would eventually provide it. When Thomas Jackson III could not find the family on any Native American rolls, he turned to genetic testing. He took an autosomal DNA test first, which gave him a broad picture of ancestry, sub-Saharan African, consistent with what history would predict for a family from the antebellum South, with some European markers that were not unusual for African American families. The European ancestry was there. Where it came from was the question. He then tested Y chromosome DNA, the direct paternal line, passed from father to son unchanged across generations, carrying the genetic signature of every man in that unbroken chain going back centuries. Y chromosome testing is the most powerful tool available for tracing the direct paternal line. The Y chromosome does not mix or dilute with each generation. Unlike autosomal DNA, it is a direct inheritance. Whatever haplogroup July carried, Nero carried. Whatever Nero carried, Samuel carried. Whatever Samuel carried, Joe Jackson carried. And whatever Joe Jackson carried, Michael Jackson carried. The Y chromosome result came back as haplogroup RFT 121435. It is a Western European haplogroup, specifically a subclade with strong frequency in the French population. Thomas then searched the testing database for matches. Other men who shared the same Y chromosome signature. He found one, a descendant of the Richborg family, a man whose direct paternal ancestors were the same French Huguenot line that had owned July on the plantation in Sumter County, South Carolina. The match was not coincidental. The Y DNA analysis confirmed that July Gale and the Richborg family shared a common ancestor, a man born before 1750, somewhere in the French Huguenot line. The most direct explanation was not a distant connection or a coincidence of haplogroups. It was the explanation the records themselves already suggested once you knew what you were looking for. July was almost certainly the biological son of James Joel Richborg, or of a close male relative in the same paternal line. This is what that means. An enslaved woman named Rose, believed to be July's mother, though her origins and history are largely undocumented, was living on the Richborg plantation in South Carolina. A white man in the Richborg family fathered a child with her. That child was July. That child was then bequeathed in a will, moved to Mississippi with a new surname taken from his enslavers, and spent the rest of his life carrying a story about his origins that the family would continue telling for 200 years. Not Native American, French Huguenot, the bloodline of Protestant refugees who had fled religious persecution in Europe, crossed an ocean, built plantations in South Carolina, and like so many other men in that system, left biological descendants in the enslaved population they own. The mechanism is the same one that runs through the DNA of millions of African American families. Enslaved women had no legal standing to refuse any man who owned them. Children born from those encounters were automatically enslaved, classified as property regardless of their father's identity. The father faced no legal consequence. The child carried the father's Y chromosome, but not his name, not his freedom, and not his version of the story. July carried a French haplogroup. He carried it into Mississippi. His son Nero carried it into freedom after emancipation. Nero's son Samuel carried it into Arkansas. Samuel's son Joseph carried it into Indiana. And Michael Jackson carried it onto every stage he ever performed on, in a body that held, encoded in its most direct paternal inheritance, the genetic signature of the man who had owned his ancestor and fathered a child who was legally his property. The surname Jackson itself is the record of that history. July's nickname was Jack. His son Nero became known as Jack's son. Jackson. The most famous surname in American popular music is a direct product of the plantation system. An enslaved man's nickname passed to his son as a surname, transformed over generations into a name the entire world would one day recognize. That is what a name can carry without anyone knowing it. Now consider what else the DNA left intact, because July was not simply a victim of the system that produced him. The records that survive about him describe a man of remarkable capability. He was known as a healer. He was engaged as a scout by the United States Army, which requires specific knowledge of terrain, navigation, and relationships with people across different communities. He acquired skills in a world designed to deny him everything, and he passed those skills down in the form of family stories that his descendants carried for 2 centuries. The family's belief in Native American ancestry was not a lie. It was the closest available explanation for something real. The unusualness of July's features, his specific competencies, his position in the community around him. Families build explanations from what they can see. They did not have access to Y chromosome testing. They had oral tradition and memory, and the physical evidence of the man himself. DNA gave Thomas Jackson III a more precise answer, but it did not erase the story. It corrected one element of it, the paternal origin, while leaving everything else intact. July's skills were real. His reputation was real. His descendants' pride in him was real. The French Huguenot Y chromosome is simply the part of his biology that points to a history his family was never positioned to know. What it points to specifically is the history of the Huguenots in America. They were French Protestants who fled Catholic persecution in the 1680s. They arrived in the Carolina colonies with an ethic of hard work and community. And within a generation or two, they had built themselves into the planter class that depended on enslaved labor for its survival. Claude Philippe de Richborg's descendants became slaveholders. That is the historical fact. The ideology they had escaped, a system that classified people by birth and persecuted them for it, did not prevent their descendants from building a system that did exactly the same thing on different terms and at far greater scale. July Gale was the biological intersection of those two histories. He was the son of an enslaved woman whose origins are unknown, and the biological son of a French-descended planter who never acknowledged him. That planter bequeathed him in a will and left him to navigate a world in which his own father's bloodline was the thing most likely to harm him. And yet, from that intersection, something survived. Nero Jackson survived. Samuel Jackson survived. Joe Jackson, the man from Arkansas who moved to Indiana, who worked in a steel mill, who pushed his children onto a stage in Gary and drove them toward a music career with a combination of discipline and ambition that his children later described in complicated terms, survived and made something that outlasted him. Michael Jackson survived, and more than survived. The man who carried a French Huguenot Y chromosome in his direct paternal line, who grew up in a house full of music on the south side of Gary, who learned to move and to sing in ways that rearranged what was possible in popular culture, did not know what his DNA contained. No one had told him. The science to retrieve it did not reach his family until after he was gone. But Michael Jackson understood explicitly and repeatedly that he was the product of something long, the Pan-African imagery in his work, the attention to Black American history in his music and his films, the awareness that his family's story ran through the Great Migration, through sharecropping, through slavery, through a wall of silence that sat somewhere in the 19th century and refused to give up names. He knew the wall was there, even if he could not see past it. Now the DNA has given one answer past that wall. The direct paternal line runs through Nero Jackson, through July Gale, through a plantation in South Carolina, through a Huguenot family from France, to a common ancestor born before 1750, a man who lived and died without knowing that his bloodline would one day produce the king of pop. That is one thread, one line of inheritance pulled from an enormously complex weave. The rest of Michael Jackson's ancestry, the African roots, the maternal East African haplogroup from Catherine's side that we have examined before, the autosomal record of all the other ancestors whose contributions are folded into his DNA, tells a much larger story than any single line can contain. His ancestry was not French. It was not Native American. It was not simply African American in the flattened, undifferentiated sense that the history books often imply when they use that term. It was all of those things at once, in proportions and from origins that the Y chromosome alone can never fully map. But the Y chromosome tells one specific and irreversible truth. The name Jackson came from an enslaved man's nickname. That man's paternal line ran to France, and the path between France and a steel mill in Gary, Indiana runs directly through the plantation system of the American South, through a will written in 1804, through a transfer of ownership, through an encounter between a white planter and an enslaved woman that produced a child who was legally property and biologically the son of the man who owned him. History embedded all of that in a surname. The science eventually read it back out. What it cannot tell us is Rose's story, July's mother, the enslaved woman whose origins are undocumented, whose African ancestry, whatever it was, from wherever it came, also flows through every Jackson descendant alive today. Her name survived in family memory. Her origins did not. The Y chromosome belongs to the man who exploited her. Her contribution to the Jackson bloodline is visible only in the autosomal record, distributed across generations, impossible to isolate into a single clean line. She has no haplogroup story. She has no French flag on a genetic time tree. She has no named ancestor from a recognizable place. She has descendants. That is what she left. And somewhere in that is the question that DNA can raise, but never fully answer. Not who owned July, but who Rose was before she was anyone's property. That answer is still missing. The DNA recovered one truth, that 200 years of silence had buried. July Gale's father was not a Native American medicine man. He was a French Huguenot planter in South Carolina who left a will and left a child and left no acknowledgement of either one's connection to the other. The science made that truth undeniable. It gave the Jackson family a correction they could not have found in any archive. What it could not give them, what it cannot give any family whose history runs through the plantation system, is the full story. The names on the wrong side of the ledger. The women whose contributions are dissolved into percentage points and population averages rather than individual lines of inheritance. The specific human beings who were taken, transferred, bequeathed, and renamed, and who nonetheless passed something of themselves forward into every generation that followed. Michael Jackson's father's bloodline traces to France. His name traces to a plantation, and his music traces to something the DNA cannot measure, to the survival, across 2 centuries of deliberate erasure, of people who were never supposed to leave a record at all.